Well, hello everybody. Thank you for joining us after lunch. I know it always gets a little slumpy in the afternoon, so we appreciate you being here to talk about a topic that is near and dear to all of our hearts here today. I'm Courtney Lang. I'm Vice President of Policy for Trust, Data, and Technology at the Information Technology Industry Council. We are a global technology trade association that represents 80 member companies from across the tech ecosystem. Schneider Electric, who is here with us today, is one of our lovely member companies, and we are very excited to talk a little bit more about product security and navigating product security harmonization across borders. One of the priority areas for ITI and our member companies is harmonization and alignment, particularly as jurisdictions are increasingly focused on either taking regulatory approaches to bolster cybersecurity or alternatively, in the case of the US, moving forward with voluntary approaches to bolster cybersecurity of consumer products and devices. And so I'm really pleased to have a panel of very smart people here with me today to talk a little bit more about both what the US is doing or has done, what the EU is doing or is going to do, and then also provide the business perspective to us, talk about why navigating and harmonizing is so important for businesses, particularly in a global marketplace. So without further ado, let me introduce my panelists. Directly to my left, I have Kat Megas from the National Institute of Standards and Technology. She has done quite a lot of work on the development of criteria for IoT cybersecurity in the United States. Then we have Benjamin Bügel from the European Commission, Cabinet of Hanna Virkkunen, but previously worked quite a lot on the Cyber Resilience Act development. So really pleased to have you here today. And then finally, at the end, we have Trevor Rudolph from Schneider Electric, and we are very excited to dive into the conversation. So with that, I think it would be helpful to just do a little bit of scene setting. So Kat and Benjamin, I would love it if you could just share a bit about kind of your individual government priorities in cybersecurity and kind of how you think about product cybersecurity in particular. What are some of the objectives that you set out to achieve, for example, with the Cyber Resilience Act, and then Kat, obviously in the context of some of the IoT work that you guys have done at the National Institute of Standards and Technology and how that has fed into this broader voluntary cyber trust mark program.
Perfect. Do you want to go first?
Okay, sure.
Yeah.
So cybersecurity or cybersecurity policy is a relatively young area in Europe. I mean, we started regulating in 2016 with the first NIS directive. That's a directive that places requirements on critical infrastructure, so organizational cybersecurity requirements. But we soon realized that many of the incidents that these entities are facing are actually the result of vulnerabilities in hardware and software products. And there's only that much that you can do as an organization if the market doesn't cater to your security needs, if the products that you find on the market contain vulnerabilities. And this is when we realized we need to do something about product security. So enter the Cyber Resilience Act, which is the first comprehensive piece of product regulation in the world, which tries to address these issues. And I think security by design is really crucial. It's one of the key areas in cybersecurity. If we get security by design right, I think we can solve a lot of the problems that we are seeing today.
And Kat, what about you? How is NIST thinking about product cybersecurity, and then how has that fed into the Cyber Trust Mark initiative more broadly?
Yeah. It's always interesting when you talk to colleagues and you find out you took separate paths, but you had a lot of kind of the same learning and evolution. So, typically at NIST, when we think about risk, we always think about risk and cybersecurity risk being very contextual. You really need to understand context in order to be able to think about and assess risk. And if you look at the traditional kind of NIST cybersecurity risk management framework, if you look at the OG, what I call the original RMF, risk management framework that federal agencies use, it's all very much on the organization that is using the technology, who understands the context to be able to kind of evaluate and think about managing the risk. But around in the late 2010s, we kind of had the same process where we started talking to both the people producing the technology and those who were buying and using the technology. And we realized that there was a bit of a bridge there, and that there was a shared responsibility between the organizations that build the technology into building the capabilities into those products, and then helping communicate with kind of the final customer or the consumer who needed to make use of those cybersecurity capabilities in securing the environment. And so we kind of shifted our guidelines. We started with kind of the robust OGRMF and the cybersecurity framework, and based on that, we derived what we said was a starting point for those people who were developing and producing products, and said, hey, here's a starting point of some cybersecurity requirements. We recognize that you may have to tailor those because it depends on the type of product you're going to be developing. So we had a couple of principles that we built that baseline around. One of them was we tried to kind of stay in the realm of defining cybersecurity outcomes. And since the S in NIST stands for standards, we felt this was really important because we wanted to give the market flexibility to adopt whichever standard was fit for purpose. Whatever standard suited the type of product, their environment, their risk appetite, we wanted them to have the flexibility to meet their cybersecurity requirements the way they wanted to. And the other, I think, principle that we followed, we wanted this to be broadly applicable, and we'd heard a lot about fragmentation and how difficult it is, and it's not even just across economic markets, but it's even within markets, within the US, fragmentation. If you're a manufacturer, it's very difficult if you're building a product and the healthcare market has completely different kind of like requirements for you than maybe the traditional OT environment. Government, of course, even more difficult. So what we did is we came up with a core baseline, which was later then tailored to specific use cases. And one example is the IoT Cybersecurity Improvement Act of 2020 wanted to use the government purchasing power to kind of start driving up the cybersecurity in IoT products. So the IoT Cybersecurity Improvement Act was passed by Congress, which essentially directed federal agencies to only buy IoT products that meet the NIST requirements. So what we took is we took the core baseline, we tailored that. A few years later, there was a desire to do something around the consumers. And so once again, we kind of took that flexible cybersecurity outcome-based baseline, and we tailored it for consumer devices, which is, I think we're going to talk about a little bit later, the US Cyber Trust Mark, which is based on the NIST recommendations.
All right, thank you. Yeah, helpful to level set just for folks that have not been as familiar with kind of where you both started from individually in the government perspective. Trevor, I would like to ask you a little bit more, because you are a company that operates, of course, in the US and the EU, and also more broadly. What are you seeing in terms of the evolving product security landscape? Kind of what is Schneider thinking about as they are thinking about how to implement product security and make sure as the CRA comes online, as the voluntary Cyber Trust Mark program is stood up in the US, what are some of the considerations that you all are taking into account?
Sure, thank you, Courtney. So first and foremost, I'd say that this is an incredibly complex space, right? So specifically what we're talking about are government laws or regulations that focus on the cybersecurity of IoT products, right? And this journey for us really started probably around 2018, 2019 with a California state law called the Connected Devices Law, SB 327, I believe, which basically said if you have a device that can connect to the internet, it must have reasonable security features. How is that defined? Well, it kind of depends. And then from that, we had very important development in Singapore with the Singapore Cybersecurity Agency developing their cybersecurity labeling scheme, which, like the US Cyber Trust Mark, is voluntary and also focused on consumer IoT. And then you have the mother of all product security regulations in the EU's Cyber Resilience Act, which is not voluntary, and it covers basically everything under the sun. The term that the Cyber Resilience Act uses is products with digital elements, right? So it's not necessarily consumer focused, but also could include industrial use cases, which is important for Schneider Electric as a manufacturer of industrial and consumer IoT. So, broadly speaking, what we're looking at is, to the extent possible, we want these regulations to be based upon existing international standards, and not creating net new standards that make it even more complex and difficult for a manufacturer to comply with. In the industrial space, we leverage the IEC 62443 suite of standards and have advocated for basing these new regulations, especially as it impacts industrial IoT, to be based around this 62443 suite.
And so, Kat, I want to come back to the Cyber Trust Mark program and kind of how you all fed into the overall development of that program, because I understand that the criteria upon which the voluntary Cyber Trust Mark in the United States is going to be based is, based upon a lot of the work that you did, that you talked about. But if you could just share a little bit more around kind of how things had evolved with the guidance in order to kind of support that program. And then I would love to just also get Benjamin's thoughts on kind of where there are synergies, kind of where there's already alignment, and perhaps where there are gaps as well between the kind of underpinning criteria and or essential baseline requirements in the CRA.
Yeah. So as Trevor pointed out, there was a lot going on even back in 2017. Yeah. There was a lot of attention on IoT. I think it was kind of on the heels of Mirai and on the heels of understanding the role that IoT played in the Mirai attack. And also, though, an appreciation for the fact that cybersecurity does not follow boundaries. And if you look at Mirai and you look at kind of the where the compromised IoT devices were, and as we looked at them in the U.S., Executive Order 13800, we required the U.S. government to look at that. We looked, and the majority of devices that actually were attacking U.S. systems weren't even located within the U.S. So we recognized immediately this was kind of an international concern. So when we developed our baseline, the first thing we did is we did kind of a broad landscape review at that time. And we said, let's understand where there's already consensus globally. And so while there were no standards at the time, what we did is I think we have kind of a very good starting point for our two programs and what we're doing, because we looked at reports that came out of ENISA at the time. The UK government had published their Secure by Design principles. Australia had published something at the time. So we kind of started from a point where we looked internationally. As I had mentioned kind of in the journey, we were asked to then tailor that baseline, and we tailored it for the US federal government use case. And then we were asked to tailor it for the consumer market, which resulted in NIST IR 8425. And at that time, there was a keen interest from the administration to kind of put the power into the consumer's hands, to have transparency and choice. We also recognize that many IoT manufacturers were already doing a pretty good job of building cybersecurity into their products. So the purpose of the US Cyber Trust Mark was really to give and this is kind of a sweet spot for NIST, is measurement, was to give a way for the community who actually was doing the right thing to actually measure themselves against something and say, hey, I actually am doing all the right things here, and the US Cyber Trust Mark actually has been turned over to the FCC. The FCC is actually the lead agency in implementing the US Cyber Trust Mark, as Trevor mentioned. It is voluntary because it really is intended to kind of incentivize, those players who are already doing the right thing. It is going to rely on third-party testing. That was a choice that was made by the FCC. And the FCC also decided that they were going to kind of rely on what already existed with respect to kind of like in the existing infrastructure to build out and support the program. And I can't speak for the FCC, I'm just speaking here for NIST, but we do a lot of work kind of in the conformity assessment space. That is, an activity that NIST engages in quite a bit. And we think that the key to something being sustainable over time is really to take advantage of what's already out there in the marketplace and has a sustainable model and build on that rather than, trying to kind of establish a whole new infrastructure for this US Cyber Trust Mark. So I hope that kind of...
Yeah, no, that's helpful. I think kind of understanding, how things evolved and where we're at now. I mean, one of the things that I think has come up in this conversation a little bit, although perhaps we're still a bit far away, because with the CRA, we still don't have kind of the standards that are going to underpin a lot of the essential baseline requirements that you all have proposed. I mean, one of the things that we have, though, talked about is, again, this need for alignment, but then more broadly, kind of this notion of mutual recognition. And while I understand, you know, that's still a ways off, I would be interested to hear your perspectives, Benjamin, on kind of where you think there is opportunity for alignment between, you know, some of the essential baseline requirements and the things that critical and important products will be required to meet ultimately, with kind of the criteria that Kat just talked about, because I think that's, you know, certainly a stepping stone at least to mutual recognition. And then Trevor, I'll get to you after that.
Yeah, of course, when we started building our framework, we also didn't pull the requirements out of a hat, right? But we also looked at what is already out there, what kind of standards do we have? You mentioned 62443, for instance, right? What kind of IoT standards do you have in Singapore and other countries? And I think the essential requirements that we have, they are kind of a reflection of what was already out there. Maybe some of them are a little bit more ambitious than what was already out there, but in general, I think it's a reflection of that. When I look at the two regimes, as different as they are in the sense that one is voluntary and the other is mandatory, I do see that a lot of, many times, different language is used, but at the end of the day, the objectives are very similar. Yeah? So I think there is, the regimes, they can align quite easily. When it comes to the Cyber Resilience Act, okay, the law is in place now, right? So it has entered into force in December last year. We are now in the transition period, and manufacturers will have to apply. I mean, we call them manufacturers, right? I think here you would call them vendors. So the vendors, they have to apply the rules by December 2027, but in this transition period, you mentioned it, we are now creating standards, we are developing guidance, we have consultations on secondary legislation and so forth. So a lot of work is still being done to build this framework. And I think this is also a huge opportunity when you write standards to make sure that these can align with other existing or frameworks that are currently being developed in other countries. So I think I would also invite industry. Yeah, I mean, when you look at the European standardization process, this is really an industry-driven process. It's the vendors that sit down together and build those standards. By the way, when they do build those standards, they can, of course, recycle existing standards. They don't need to reinvent the wheel. So when we talk about industrial control and so forth, this is possible. But then you can, of course, since you are also in the driver's seat to some extent, you can also help us ensure that the frameworks are aligned.
Yeah. Can I just add to that?
Feel free, yeah.
Because, you know, when we started the conversations talking about harmonization, or at least talking about, you know, the opposite, hopefully, of fragmentation.
Yes.
I think there's
alignment, if not total harmonization. Yes.
You know, I think there's varying degrees of it, and I think the way I always thought about it, I said, okay, the worst case scenario would be if we're actually putting out requirements that are conflicting, in which case there was absolutely no way that a manufacturer could meet both of the requirements without creating two different types of products. This still creates a lot of work for you guys, but at least there's one, hopefully, product, you know? And then I think the next layer up is, okay, we have similar requirements, but there are also some kind of like independent requirements. And I think kind of on the spectrum would be, what would you call it, harmonization and mutual recognition, which is everything is perfectly aligned. So I think it's important for us to talk about the spectrum of possibilities, because, you know, the absolute worst would be having not all been kind of thinking about the same problem at around the same time and, you know, paying attention to what each other was doing. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Trevor, I mean, from your perspective, of course, as a company operating globally, what are the benefits that you think could come from, I mean, obviously, ultimately mutual recognition, but in general, greater alignment? I mean, I know we talked a little bit about reliance on kind of international standards as some of the standards are being developed for the CRA. I mean, what kind of tangible benefits would actually come from that type of alignment?
Yeah, I mean, the bottom line is all manufacturers want to benefit from, you know, economies of scale. We want to build or manufacture a product once, secure it once, and then be able to sell it globally in all relevant markets. without additional kind of testing and certification requirements. That is today not a reality, right? Especially given the kind of numerous product security requirements that are out there. That being said, I'm actually quite hopeful on mutual recognition, and I think we should probably define mutual recognition just really quick for the audience. And so when I use that term, in particular, I'm talking about being able to, in one jurisdiction, take advantage of a particular, let's say, certification scheme to show compliance with a certain regulation, and then in a second jurisdiction, being able to get credit for the work you've done in the first jurisdiction, and not have to kind of repeat the same compliance steps in that second jurisdiction or third jurisdiction. I'm very hopeful. We can talk about this maybe later, but there are actual examples of mutual recognition that exist between multiple governments throughout the world, but the list is frankly too short.
Yes.
Too short, and we do not have the Americans or the Europeans in the mutual recognition agreements that I'm referring to, at least not at the European level. We have member states, which is good, but not at the European level.
I mean, now is a good time as any to talk about some of those examples. I mean, yes, you referenced, I think, Singapore. I know that Finland has been focused on, product security. What are some tangible examples of mutual recognition, and how is it working?
Yeah, so this all stems from the Singapore Cyber Agency from 2020 when they developed their cyber labeling scheme, which again is consumer focused and voluntary, but it's based upon existing ETSI standards for consumer IoT. And they quickly, being a leader in this space, developed mutual recognition agreements with Germany, Finland, South Korea, and also the Connectivity Standards Alliance, which I believe is the universe of mutual recognition agreements in this space today. We would like to see the Americans at the table for potentially future mutual recognition agreements, especially as it relates to the Cyber Trust Mark. And then to the extent it's possible in the context of the CRA, we'd also like to see mutual recognition, at least for the consumer aspects of the CRA scope initially, and then long-term a roadmap to, let's say, industrial IoT as well.
Okay,
It's a dream.
Yes.
We can dream, right?
Fair enough.
Yeah.
I mean, do either of you have perspectives on kind of the utility of mutual recognition or the possibility? I know we're still in the early days for a lot of this, but would be interested if you had any further thoughts on that.
So again, I think there's a spectrum.
Yeah.
I think that is an ideal world, right? Do it once, but do it once, test once, get accepted in one place, and then kind of like a passport, just have it be recognized everywhere you go. But I think there are other models. The U.S. has a mutual recognition agreement signed with the EU on the RED, right? The Radio Equipment Directive, right? And that is more of the flavor that if you're a U.S. manufacturer and you want to sell your products in Europe, but you want to work with the U.S. laboratory because it's easier for you, it's domestic, it's, they speak the same language, so there's less of a language barrier. It's an agreement that was established between the U.S. and the EU, where the EU trusts these laboratories in the U.S. to test the product, and then submit it to the European authorities and have them accept that report. Now that doesn't mean that getting the check mark on the RED then just automatically means that that the FCC also recognizes that you've met all the FCC kind of requirements. So again, there's kind of different flavors of mutual recognition, and it can be as simple as test once, have one test report, submit it to many authorities, but have them all accept the same report. And in that instance, you can have slightly different requirements, but you can build one product. You can, as long as you don't have conflicting requirements, you can take it to be tested once, but you may still have to take it to multiple authorities, right? And so I think there is some flexibility in the way we think about this, and I hope that we can kind of stay imaginative and kind of keep all the opportunity on the table, because I'm worried if we always talk about absolutely harmonizing, I think that's going to be very difficult, because the reality is we started from a common point. You guys started from a common point as well. But what we had to do as NIST and as part of the Department of Commerce, our mission is to support U.S. manufacturers and support U.S. competition. So we took that research and we tailored it for our stakeholders, right? The U.S. market, our U.S. manufacturers. Our stakeholder community probably looks very different than Singapore's, very different than UK. So everybody, I imagine, is going to be doing the same thing, which is why I think we are never going to be able to be 100% the same.
Yep.
But I still am hopeful for the ability to still have good outcomes without looking exactly the same. So I don't know if you agree.
Yeah,
Benjamin.
not asking anyone to promise anything here, just interested in overall perspectives on kind
Yeah.
of, as you know, the spectrum, kind of where we might be able to make some progress. I mean, Benjamin, I would be interested in your thoughts because I know, one of the key differences in ethos, I suppose, is that as we've mentioned, it's voluntary in the US, it is a hard law requirement in the EU, and I know that can be, challenging to bridge in certain instances, right? Because again, it is incumbent in the US upon the manufacturer to actually enter into that program, et cetera. But certainly it would seem that there is an opportunity at least for them to then demonstrate if the requirements, as we've noted, are essentially the same at some point, to also say, hey, this is, I know the process is different in the EU as well. We haven't talked about kind of the conformity assessment CE mark component of this. However, maybe we can kind of get into that a little bit, if you would.
Yeah, I mean, as you probably know, I mean, the EU was a long time ago created as kind of a peace project, right? But one of the flagships of the EU is really its single market. And the single market is all about overcoming fragmentation. I mean, this is one of the main reasons why the EU exists today, to make companies more competitive by saving costs, by ensuring that you don't have, because we have 27 member states, right? So potentially there could be 27 product security regimes in the EU, but there will only be one. And that's, of course, good for you. Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, what I'm trying to say is it's kind of in our DNA that we seek, that we want to facilitate the lives for companies and ensure that you don't have to comply with too many regulations that have the same objectives, right? And the Cyber Resilience Act is also so for those of you who don't know those differences, in EU law there are basically two types of laws. There are regulations which apply directly in the whole of the EU, and then there are directives which have to be transposed by each member state into national law. And of course, if you do that, you also there is always a risk of a certain divergence between those national transpositions. So for the CRA, we chose as vehicle the regulation because we believe that it's really beneficial for companies to have like a single rule book. And we are, of course, also aware that the CRA does not only apply to European companies, but it applies to a lot of international companies. There are a lot of vendors that are not based in the EU, in the US, in Asia, everywhere basically. And this is why the CRA has really also been designed to be compatible and to allow for international cooperation. So for instance, we have one article, Article 34, which is about mutual recognition. So it creates that possibility to do mutual recognition. Kat said it, I mean, it's a spectrum mutual recognition, right? That doesn't always have to mean full recognition of someone else's regime. It can also you can also mutually recognize certain elements. For instance, a conformity assessment could be one of these elements. But in general, the framework that we have built, it allows to take further steps and to collaborate with other jurisdictions and facilitate the lives of companies.
Trevor, I would love to ask you a little bit more about your perspectives on kind of international standards, because I know right now, at least looking ahead, we are still waiting, as I noted, for kind of CEN-CENELEC and the European standards bodies to develop the standards that will, actually allow companies to comply in some regard with the CRA. So, curious about your perspectives on kind of where that might be going. And, I know you mentioned kind of the reliance on international standards. What would you suggest moving forward in terms of, how do we kind of bridge the gap in the meantime?
Sure. So I guess short answer is it's complicated.
Yes.
International standards that are industry-led take a whole lot of time to craft, right? And it's kind of an ongoing project where these standards are updated on an ongoing basis. But if you take an example from the Radio Equipment Directive Delegated Act, 3 standards were derived, and it took several years, 2 years to be precise, I think, to develop those standards for the RED DA. And one of the concerns that we have, as it relates to the CRA specifically, is if you assume that it takes about 10 or so months to do one standard, the CRA actually requests 43 individual standards, both horizontal and vertical, to implement the essential requirements. So if you just do some basic multiplication, it might take up to 35 years for the CRA standards to be finalized. Now, if you assume for a second that there are benefits and learning from the RED process and there's a sequential nature to the development of some of these standards, you might reduce that to, let's say, 12 to 15 years, being generous. Well, let's be even more generous and cut that number in half. You still have a date that is well beyond 2027, which is the applicability date, or the date that the CRA will go into force for all manufacturers, and the requirements will be real. So we got a problem, right? At least in my assessment, based upon my very generous math. And it begs the question, well, what do we do by 2027? And our assessment is that it might be viable to, in some cases, leverage existing international standards like 62443 for industrial control systems instead of necessarily waiting for net new standards to be crafted by CENELEC, which is, to Benjamin's point, it is an industry-led process, but the Commission also has a heavy hand, right, in terms of ensuring that the resulting standards comply with their expectations and the essential requirements and things of that nature.
Yeah. Benjamin, I
There's
mean, I know.
got to be a counterpoint.
No, I think, it's helpful to kind of understand your specific perspectives on where the challenges lie. I mean, Benjamin, I know that there is the standardization request already out to send
Yes.
CENELEC. I mean, can you share any information about kind of where in the process things are at? Is it as horrible as Trevor has indicated?
No, it's not as horrible as indicated. So we came out indeed with a standardization request in the beginning of the year. It's addressed to CENELEC and ETSI. These are the 3 European standardization organizations. They are not EU institutions, but they have a special standing in our law, and they have been tasked to create those standards. They have also accepted the standardization request. I'm much more optimistic than you are. I would also really like to see the methodology that leads to 35 years, I think you said.
We're going to publish it, yes.
Yeah, I would really like to see that, because I cannot imagine that it will take 35 years. I mean, first of all, what is really good news is that we see that the standardizers have started way ahead of the standardization request, right? They didn't even wait for the Commission's official request to launch the work. They started right after the CRA came into force. They started working on those standards, and I've been involved in some of the standardization work. I've seen some of the drafts, so this is very promising in my view. Now, of course, the number that you mentioned is correct there. It's a large amount of standards that we are requesting, and it is ambitious, but these are mostly product-specific standards, right? So these are standards for different product categories. And each of these standards will, of course, be developed by a slightly different community, right? So when we think of a standard for operating systems, I would imagine that vendors involved in operating systems will work on this. Yeah, when we talk about a standard for firewalls, I would imagine that the firewall vendors will get together. So all these standards, they will be created in parallel and not in sequence. And of course, there is some overlap between the standards, but in general, I think there will be the capacity to build those standards, because it's always different community involved in each of those standards. Now, you mentioned that there are different types of standards. That's true. So the standardization request is kind of like a pyramid, right? At the very top, we are requesting a so-called Type A standard. That's like a generic standard that bootstraps the whole framework, that provides terminology, and most importantly, that also shapes the expectations towards all the other standards, right? I mean, it will basically say all other standards should contain the following elements. So all these fundamental discussions, they will not have to take place over and over and over again for each of the product-specific standards, right? So when a community gets together to write a product-specific standard, they can really just focus on the technical elements, yeah? What are the technical requirements that we want to put in the standard. They do not need to have all these fundamental discussions again. So that's why I'm much more optimistic. And I mean, of course, there are already a lot of standards out there that can also easily be recycled. You mentioned 62443, right? That's a very mature framework. It's quite compatible with the CRA. I mean, not fully, so it will need to be adjusted to some extent. But there is a lot of compatibility and there is a lot of expertise out there. And I don't see why this would take 35 years.
Yeah, and just to full disclosure on the arithmetic here, right? So we're looking at the Radio Equipment Directive Delegated Act standardization process, and the reason we're looking at that is it is a precursor to the CRA, right? The scope is very, very similar between the RED and the CRA. And we do know that it took, on average, 10 months to finalize one standard. There are 3 total standards for the RED DA. We're taking 10 months, multiplying it by the 43. You get a number, divide that by 12, you get 35 years. That is if everything is done on a straight line and nothing is happening in parallel.
Right.
Assuming that there is some sort of sequential, or excuse me, some sort of concurrent element to the standardization process, that's when we actually lower that number of years to something more generous, which is still 12 to 15. And I think that's what we need to figure out is how quickly can we benefit from the learnings from the RED DA process so that we're not completely recreating the wheel and we get to something that looks and feels and smells like 2027
Yeah.
or earlier, right?
Sure. And if I could plug
Yeah.
62443, and
Yeah.
if I could argue why it would be a good thing to use that as a starting point. Because while the U.S. Cyber Trust Mark is indeed voluntary, the IoT Cybersecurity Improvement Act of 2020 is not. So if you are going to be selling an OT system to the U.S. federal government, you will have to comply with 213. But we already know that 62443 pretty much can map to 800-213. So if there is going to be, this is the benefit in kind of starting from a common place and tailoring, rather than just trying to kind of like grow something from the ground up, because then the likelihood of us then on the U.S. federal government side and procuring products for the U.S. federal government, we're then looking at potential kind of bifurcation there. So I would like to encourage, I guess, Sensenelec to build on these existing standards in some cases. So hopefully then you're also taking a shortcut. So you're fast tracking as well as kind of taking some shortcuts to getting to 2027. And I think it would be beneficial for all.
Yeah, I don't know if we have standards experts in the room, but
We like throwing numbers out there.
we have 62443 experts embedded in Sensenelec, right? That is part of the process, right? But a lot of this comes down to basic definitions and getting those right, and you've got people from all over the world and dozens of manufacturers at the table, and it's a very, very heavy and cumbersome process that even if you're benefiting from existing work and existing standards, it is not straightforward.
Yeah, fair.
Yeah.
And that's
Okay.
where my skepticism on 2027 really comes about.
Understood.
By the way, one thing I have learned in my work on the Cyber Resilience Act is if you want to show proficiency in this space, you have to spell out those standard names as fast as possible. So 62443.
Yes.
You make it punchy.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we're kind of coming to time here, and I want to leave a couple of minutes for audience questions as well. But would be interested to hear your perspectives on kind of what are the areas that governments and industry can work together on kind of most immediately, I would say, over the next several months in order to really progress us towards, if not full mutual recognition, more alignment, better alignment. And I ask that to each of you to kind of lay out what you think, potential next steps might look like.
I mean, I could go first, but as I stated, the U.S. Cyber Trust Mark is owned and kind of led by the FCC. For those who are interested in the U.S. Cyber Trust Mark, UL has been selected as the lead administrator, and they've been running kind of a process, working with stakeholders here in the US, kind of preparing as the lead administrator for the US Cyber Trust Mark. So I would encourage those of you who are interested. Unfortunately, that does put the burden on folks like you, Trevor, because you have to participate in standards development and the UL process. But hopefully, you guys can also serve as a little bit of the connective tissue in participating in both of these. So while I think, hopefully, and again, I can't speak for the FCC, I'm sure there are plans to engage in discussions going forward with the European Commission. But I think also there's work that can be done by you all kind of like bridging both sides as well and ensuring there's kind of like consistent work on both sides.
Benjamin, thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I fully agree with this. I think industry here really is also key. I mean, you are the ones that will have to apply those rules, whether voluntary or mandatory. And I would really invite you to be active in the European standardization process, contribute to the guidance that we're building. We also have an expert group where some companies are members, also participate in all the consultation activities that are ongoing for secondary legislation. I think because you are the ones that will have to apply these frameworks, so I think you are also best placed to understand where the pain points are and where we really need to make sure that we agree on what we mean when we use different terminology and so forth. I mean, the European Commission, we are quite active on cybersecurity internationally. We have different cyber dialogues with countries around the world. And we've also collaborated very closely in the last years, for instance, with CISA, right? So we've jointly agreed on security by design guidance and so forth. And I mean, we, of course, are always happy to engage further. Yeah.
Trevor?
Yeah, I would say the key here is international dialogue, right? We're in a very, very dynamic kind of geopolitical environment right now, but I'm frankly very optimistic and hopeful that at the technical levels that international dialogue can continue. I would also just plug that the Singaporeans are clear international leaders, specifically in the mutual recognition space. And to the extent that both the Europeans and the Americans can collaborate with Singapore on future efforts, I think that would be very productive for all involved.
Wonderful. Well, I would like to invite the audience, if you have questions, to please, there's 2 microphones. If you would like to come up and ask, we'd welcome them. Yeah, feel free.
Hey there, I'm Maggie Morganti, a former illustrious colleague of Trevor Rudolph. And I wanted to ask, one of the pieces that I don't feel like I heard a ton of discussion on is if we could magically snap our fingers and say, okay, Singapore, CRA, all of the US regulation that's coming down the pipeline, as of tomorrow is going to let you map to 62443. Do we currently feel like auditors like TÜV are prepared to absorb the volume of inquiries to even allow OEMs to attest in time, or is that something that we feel like still would need quite a bit of ramp up to be successful?
I'm interested in, Benjamin, your perspective on that. I've got a perspective, but you know.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to the Cyber Resilience Act, for the vast majority of cases, companies, they can self-certify. We call that self-attestation. And that means you don't need to go to a third party, basically, right? It's only for a small number of products that you would actually be required to go to a third party. The so-called critical products that are listed in the annex of the Cyber Resilience Act, these are more, I would say, root of trust kind of devices, such as smart cards and things like that. So there you're obliged to go to a third party. But for the vast majority of products, you will have the choice to apply a harmonized standard, for instance, or really for the majority of products, you can just self-certify without going to a third party, because of course, I mean, you're right, we also have a cybersecurity skills gap, right? So we don't have an infinite number of people that are able to test products. But this is basically our answer. This is how we made the system proportionate to ensure that this doesn't happen. Yeah.
Right. And any good panel must have a little bit of tension. So I would say that although I agree conceptually with what Benjamin just said, the problem that I've run into, I've got specific evidence of this, is manufacturers don't necessarily know what a self-assessment process looks like. And so they get a little nervous, a little skittish when it comes to what does that mean, and can I truly self-attest, and am I going to be compliant with the requirements? They actually go to an independent third-party assessor and they say, we're going to give you money to tell us that we're good. And so that creates a situation where even though the intent is self-assessment, in practice you hit a situation where the TVs of the world are overwhelmed. And I think that is an unintended outcome of the CRA that we need to get ahead of. And so I'll say publicly right now that I think that it would be helpful for the commission to issue more specific guidance on what self-assessment really looks like so that we avoid this problem.
I'd also be curious, and I'm putting another penny in somebody's penny jar out there by mentioning AI, but is there an opportunity, you think, to kind of leverage this emerging technology as a way to assist organizations in their, whether it be a testing harness that's leveraging some of this new technology? I wonder if there's ways to kind of help this, which I agree with you is absolutely going to be a shortage.
I hope so.
Potentially,
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's a lot of emerging applications, so it seems like, you know, it could be possible. I don't know what the landscape.
Could be.
Yeah,
could be.
I mean,
you know.
AI or not, I think technology is very helpful with compliance in general, I would say, not just self-assessment.
Sure. Yeah.
We as Commission, we are also providing money so the tooling can be built in support of CRA compliance. And we of course hope that this will be very helpful facilitations for companies.
Correct, because I've been hearing a lot of tools that help you develop an SBOM, which is a form
document
of
generation
transparency.
and
Right, so hopefully we can also develop some tools to help these processes make it easier for manufacturers to be transparent about what they're doing.
Okay.
Yeah.
I see a final question here.
Yes,
Yes.
Sam Spector with Lenovo. When Secretary Noem was speaking yesterday, she was talking about the Secure by Design pledge at one point, but very soon after that, started talking about using the purchasing power of the U.S. government to ensure more secure products were on the market. She talked about security add-ons, I guess kind of a secure by default standard in place. We have the Biden administration executive order that has not been rescinded that included a provision that would require federal procurement of devices with the Cyber Trust mark by early 2027.
Right.
I'm wondering what, if any, relationship might there be? Are we hearing anything about a plan to make Cyber Trust mark mandatory, at least for the range of products that it currently covers?
Yeah. So the IoT Cybersecurity Improvement Act already establishes a minimum baseline for the U.S. government. The good thing is, because of the approach NIST took, here I'm throwing out more numbers, 800-213, which is used by the government, and 8425, which is used by the U.S. Cyber Trust mark, both were based on 8259. That was the basis. They've been a little bit tailored because the U.S. federal government does have some different requirements. So I would like to say I think there's a lot of potential there. If you are going to be working towards the U.S. Cyber Trust mark, chances are you are meeting the requirements of 800-213, at least the baseline requirements of 213. The other thing as well is there is an SSDF attestation that's required already for software products. We've done a lot of, NIST. If you know NIST, we love our mappings. Do we love our mappings? So we've already kind of looked between the SSDF, some of the IoT cybersecurity baselines. There's already a lot of similarities in a lot of this. I'm not sure yet about the implementation of what Secretary Noem referred to, but I'm hoping there's not going to be anything conflicting, and hopefully there will be a lot of reusability.
Thank you.
All right. Well, I think we are at time. Really appreciate you all joining us today for this conversation. Hopefully you learned something, and we'll look forward to being back hopefully next year.
Oh,
All right. Thanks,
thank you.
everyone.
Thank you.